I'm Jenara Nerenberg. I'm a journalist, and what brought me here today is something that I think probably resonates for many folks in the room and is sort of a core human experience, a quality, a trait that's often found amongst artists and scientists and writers and researchers. And this is the trait of sensitivity. And sensitivity, I've found in my own life and also as a journalist and interviewing lots of folks, it's actually something that we don't talk about that much. We kind of take it for granted. Sensitivity is, what's responsible for, when you notice a friend when they're sad and perhaps their facial expressions shift subtly, right? It's responsible for kind of tipping you off to what you want to cook for dinner at night. It's also responsible for deciding, which of your passions and curiosities to pursue. And I was a very sensitive kid and always got that feedback. And it was something that people would always describe as sort of a defining characteristic. I was one of those kids that always wanted to know what the grown-ups were talking about and was always listening in on their conversations and wanted to engage in a way that many of my peers weren't. And I was drawn to the life of the mind and sort of one's inner life and philosophical conversations and things like this from a young age. And I grew up in a family and sort of an extended family environment that was pretty unique. So I grew up in San Francisco in public schools in the outer avenues of San Francisco, pre-Silicon Valley. Do we have any San Francisco natives here? Nice. So I grew up amongst families that were first-generation immigrant families, primarily from Asia as well as Eastern Europe. And in my own family, we had mixed race couples and almost all of the world's major religions represented. And this was my norm, this really was my norm, to sort of be surrounded by difference in a way, but we were all together and we were all united. So in a way it was being sheltered, but in a very opposite sense of that word, right? In an opposite way that we usually use that word. As I got older, this trait of sensitivity started to become a little more challenging for me. I was sort of so in my mind all the time that I didn't notice my physical surroundings much. I was a super messy kid, and I wouldn't notice clutter and things like this. So you can imagine that sort of as you go into adulthood and you have to take on more challenges, that this would present more of a challenge. So what I thought was, a major gift and sort of contributed to a lot of my creativity in life started to become more of a problem, really. And it didn't seem like it was an inherent issue, but more the result of how my sort of makeup was interacting with the outside world. And so in college and then afterwards when I graduated and work-wise, I was able to use this as a journalist. I was a foreign correspondent in Asia for 6 years. I had graduated with highest honors from UC Berkeley, went to the Harvard School of Public Health. I was a reporter for CNN and Fast Company magazine and Healthline. So it became confusing to reconcile all of that, the sort of like fancy degrees and publications and that kind of thing, with some really basic sort of adulting challenges with switching gears, sort of like executive functioning challenges, going from, hyper-focus on an essay or an article to doing the dishes or doing the laundry and, setting the timers so that when I'm done with the dishes, I go to the laundry and things like that. So it was really confusing for me. I didn't understand, and things just got harder for me as I got older. So then suddenly, on Facebook, of all places, I think was listening to the conversations I was having, because I was talking about all this to my therapist, to my family, and to my friends, and I was trying to figure this out. And suddenly, all these articles started popping up on my feed about areas of mental health research that had historically and systematically left women out of the picture. And so there were whole diagnoses and areas of research being put together without that sort of print of women. So there were many diagnoses being formed around studies based on men and boys. And so in particular, in the context of something like ADHD and autism. So these articles started coming out about that basically we had like entire lost generations of women, and that the presentation of something like ADHD or autism looked quite different in women as compared to men. And that what was happening is that women, sort of as they got older and faced more sort of like, the highly regimented world, were developing layers and layers of shame and anxiety and depression. And so those were the only things that were being seen, right? So like an onion, a woman would land in a therapist's office complaining about certain things, but only these outer layers of depression and anxiety were being looked at. And so the sort of deeper core, whether it was like a sensory difference or a neurological trait, was being entirely missed, and that a lot of therapists and a lot of doctors were not up to speed on this kind of research. And so again, this lost generation of women, right? So I couldn't deny that what I was reading was resonating. So this began two threads for me. The first thing I did was get a small group of people together in one room right here in Berkeley. 30 of us gathered in a small Berkeley studio to kind of get together and talk about some of these things and really open up about our inner worlds. And we had singers and dancers alongside, folks from corporate tech companies, scientists, academics, and researchers. And the idea was to really come as our full selves, right? And show up as our whole self, and also to reconcile these things, yes, acknowledge our successes and our accomplishments right alongside, opening up about a diagnosis of bipolar or autism or dyslexia or ADHD. So we had this room full of people doing just that, really showing up as their full selves and talking about these things as just mere differences, right? And so we did that again, and we did it again. And then as a journalist, I started to invite authors to come in and talk with us about their new research, their new books, so that we could find out what was happening more in the realm of research and science. So we continue to do that. We host an ongoing author event series with best-selling authors from design and the arts and psychology and medicine. Last year we hosted our first retreat. Today you're here for our very first conference. So thank you so much for being with us. And so at the same time, this other thread for me was I started digging deeper as a journalist and looking at sensory differences. I've been chronicling this research and sort of my own experience in a book called Divergent Mind. And what became clear to me in interviews with people across the US and abroad is that this trait of sensitivity was this core trait that was showing up across diagnoses. And it was always referred to as a gift. So primarily with something like synesthesia that you heard about earlier, the autism spectrum, ADHD, SPD, which is sensory processing disorder, and then the HSP, which is the highly sensitive person, which is more described as a personality trait and it's a term coined by my friend and colleague, Elaine Aron. So I've just thought a lot about this trait of sensitivity, and at what point does it dip over into a diagnosis? At what point is it just something that we all share sort of as human beings? What is the utility of diagnosis? And even though we acknowledge it, that every person kind of possesses this, for many of us, it presents a challenge, even into adulthood. And for me, what I've found in my research is that things like the way work environments are set up, the way our schools function, even expectations within relationship dynamics or family dynamics, loud noises, bright lights, the experience of sensory overload, migraines, all of these things that I'm prone to. It became clear that, the way sort of our daily structures and systems are set up, those things can be quite disabling. And it leaves many of us sort of alienated and isolated and not finding a way to sort of plug into the world and plug into how environments operate. So, like I said, what happens is that many people will end up in a therapist's office or a doctor's office just utterly confused. So the idea with the Neurodiversity Project and with sort of the articles that I've been working on and with my book that's coming out is to keep kind of opening up these conversations and tweak our narratives. We need to respond to sensitivity differently. We need to sort of update the media at large about what something like autism looks like or ADHD. We need to press researchers to include more women, right? Can we get a... Sort of the essential question for me is, and this applies to everyone and to our world at large, but is, are we leaving some of our most sensitive, gifted individuals sort of out? Are we alienating people who potentially have, a vision or contributions that really hold, in some sense, like the antidote to how fractured our world is, right? And what does that say about us? Is that really how we want to operate? Is that really how we want our companies to function and our families and our schools? Is that the choice we want to make? Or are there ways to make space for folks who identify as neurodivergent and who are eager and hungry to be a part of the world and just haven't really known how to do that? In the world of architecture and design, for example, architects are finding that design that is best for autistic folks is really design that's best for everyone, okay? When it comes to color choices and lighting and things like that. And this is happening across the board. People who I've interviewed at leading tech companies who are given the freedom and the space to be as they are and to innovate, they're really quickly taking up leadership positions, and then how do their ideas and their visions and orientation to the world shape policies and our environments? And since we're talking about, the relationship between media and society today, how can we make more space for neurodivergent narratives and neurodivergent stories to inform how characters are portrayed in the media, or how we look at solutions that are portrayed in the media. So this needs to become, a larger conversation. This is just a brief introduction. I want to invite you all to take part, and we're so excited you're here. We have events throughout the year. We have articles. Please, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. And we're just excited to grow with you all, and I want to thank you all so much for being here.